Hello everyone, welcome to MMBS-111 Introductory Microbiology. This mini lecture will address content from section 4.5 of chapter 4, and we are talking about the helminths, or the worms. There are 4 learning outcomes for this mini lecture. First, be able to name the 2 major groups of helminths. Second, be able to describe the differences in body types between those 2 groups. Third, explain the difference between an intermediate and a definitive host. And 4, describe the organ system which is most developed in helminths and be able to explain why. Alright, so the helminths are the worms, and we have 2 groups of worms in the helminths. We have the flatworms, which include tapeworms and flukes, and then we have the roundworms. Adult helminths are usually large enough to be seen with the naked eye, so we don't have to study these using microscopes, but the egg and larval stage tends to be microscopic. Not all helminths are parasites. Many of them live free in the soil and water and don't cause any issues for humans. Parasitic helminths must spend part of their life within the gastrointestinal tract of their host. There are a number of sources for human infection, and those include contaminated food, soil, and water, or the consumption of animals which are infected with the helminth. Contamination tends to be fecal contamination, and routes of infection are generally oral, so we typically get these infections through ingestion. Some infections take place when the cyst or the larval form of the worm is able to penetrate the skin through a cut or a wound. So our first group of helminths are the flatworms, and these are classified in the phylum Platyhelminthes. They have a thin, often segmented body plan, as you can see in the tapeworm example there on the screen. And each segment is called a proglottid. And the proglottid is the means that tapeworms use to reproduce and infect hosts. There are 2 groups within the Platyhelminthes. We have the cestodes, which are tapeworms, and then we also have the trematodes, which are the flukes. And you can see an example of a fluke in the bottom right. It is the very flat, bulging kind of worm there. The other group are the roundworms, and these are classified in the phylum Aschelminthes. They have an elongated cylindrical body. Their body is not segmented, so it is continuous. And roundworms are also known as nematodes. And you can see here that there are distinct male and female members of the species. So let's talk about how these organisms reproduce and what is involved in their life cycle. So all 3 worms complete a life cycle using first a fertilized egg, then the larva develops, and then we have the adult stage. Adults derive their nutrients from and reproduce sexually within the body of their host. And they reproduce differently. So our roundworms, or the nematodes, have separate sexes. So we have a male worm and a female worm. So these worms reproduce sexually with separate sexes. The trematodes, the sexes can be separate, or the worm can be hermaphroditic. So the worm possesses both male and female sex organs. The cestodes, or the tapeworms, are typically all hermaphroditic, which means they all forms possess both male and female parts. Here's an example of the life cycle of a helminth. The infective stage is typically the egg or the larval stage, and the eggs or proglottids, if we're talking about the tapeworm, will infect first the intermediate host, and the intermediate host is the host that is first contaminated by the eggs. The organisms tend to be asymptomatic, so they don't behave sick, but we have the eggs developing into this larval stage, or the oncosphere. And the oncosphere is shed from the intermediate host, generally in feces, or sometimes it may contaminate muscle tissue, and then that gets consumed. And then the larva then develops within the definitive host, and this is where the adult stage grows and develops and reproduces. As you can see here, we get the development of the adult tapeworm within the intestine of the human host. You can see that tapeworms have a special feature called the scolex, and that attaches to the intestine and helps to adhere the tapeworm within the body of the definitive host. And then proglottids or eggs are shed in the feces of the definitive host, and then that process continues. So domestic animals, cattle or pigs, are going to ingest those eggs or proglottids, depending on which it is, and then that process continues. Fertilized eggs are released into the environment, generally in the feces of the definitive host. They are provided with a protective shell and extra food to ensure that they develop into a larva. They are able to survive limited changes within the environment. So they are very vulnerable to things like excessive heat or cold, lack of moisture, as well as any predators. Certain helminths can lay from 200,000 to 25 million eggs a day to assure that they complete or successfully complete their life cycle. So it's pretty astounding the number of eggs that are produced by some of these worms. There are about 50 species of helminths that parasitize humans, and they are distributed in all areas of the world. They are more predominant in tropical areas, but I just read an article today about a large number of cases of hookworm in the southern United States. So they can be found in a number of places around the world. Generally, they are more prevalent in areas of poverty or where there is lack of good sanitation. Yearly estimates of cases are in the billions, and there are about 50 million helminth infections just in North America. So it's not limited to developing countries, but certainly more developed countries also experience these types of infection. So make sure that you go through these questions, check your understanding, go back and review the learning objectives, make sure that you can address each one of those, and hopefully this video was helpful.